It's pretty. Does it have?
Hi all, welcome. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful, thank you so kindly. Welcome, thank you for joining us this evening here at Green Apple Books on the Park in beautiful San Francisco, California, and wherever you are tuning in from online. Thank you online. I'm very happy to be here this evening with Linda Kinstler and Isaac Chotiner for our discussion on Linda's book, Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you this evening. Thank you for joining us. I have very brief business, and then we'll get to the heart of the matter. First, please do check out our event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We have a pretty great season ahead of us. I'm a pretty biased person, but we do have a great season ahead of us, so if you enjoy what you see tonight, you might enjoy something in the future. Thank you also for keeping your mask on this evening. We're just trying to move forward and be a little safer and also be celebratory, so we appreciate you being cool about it. We also want to give our authors the grace to take theirs off while they're here. So thank you for that. Thank you also for purchasing Linda Kinstler's book that we have available at the front register. If you've been here before, you might have heard me say that when you buy a book from us here at an independent bookstore, you not only support us, you support the author who put so much work into writing this book, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So thank you for doing so if you are able. We always appreciate it. I'd like to say also as well that Linda planned this with me to be held on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I'm really glad to be here with you all together, and I think it's important during our continual cultural upheaval and with gaining anti-Semitism in our country and abroad that we be here together, and that it's important to be here to honor the millions killed under the Nazi regime, Jews and non-Jews alike, and to honor the victims of all genocide. And I think it's important that we be here together to say never again. So thank you for being here with me to say never again. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us this evening. First, Isaac Chotiner is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he is the principal contributor to Q&A, a series of interviews with public figures in politics, media, books, business, technology, and more. Before joining The New Yorker, Chotiner was a staff writer at Slate and the host of the podcast I Have to Ask. He's written for The New Yorker, The Times, The Atlantic, The Times Literary Supplement, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. After graduating from UC Davis, he worked at The Washington Monthly before joining The New Republic in 2006 as a reporter and researcher. He went on to run the magazine's online book section and later became a senior editor. Please give a hand for Isaac Chotiner. And last but most certainly not least, Linda Kinstler is the deputy editor of The Dial and a contributing writer to the 1843 magazine and Jewish Currents. Her reporting and criticism on issues of memory, politics, technology, law, and history can be found in The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, The Guardian, and elsewhere. She is also a PhD candidate in rhetoric at UC Berkeley. Her first book, Come to This Court and Cry, is an investigation into denialism, historical revisionism, and judicial overreach in Eastern Europe. It was also recently longlisted for the Wingate Prize. It is also the reason we are here tonight, so please join me in welcoming Linda Kinstler.
Linda, good to see you.
You too.
Good to be here. This is a really fantastic book that I hope everyone will get a chance to read. I finished it this week, and I was thinking, Linda and I used to work together at the New Republic magazine, and I was thinking to try and describe this book, a magazine editor would have said, you can't do this book because it's so many different things within. It's like a spy story, it's a mystery, it's a history book, it's a family memoir, and the way she weaves it all together is really astonishing. And so I want to talk about a lot of different aspects of it without ruining any of the kind of mysterious aspects that will keep you reading. And I also want to talk about what sort of book she set out to write, because I think I'm reading between the lines of her book, I think she wrestled with that a lot. But I want to talk about the story you tell, but I thought first maybe it would be good for you to talk a little bit about Latvia and that country in the first half of the 20th century, because for people like myself who are not experts in Eastern Europe, sort of keeping track of Latvia in the first half of the 20th century is very difficult. And so just to give people a little sense, and then we can talk more directly about the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think
what's so interesting to me about Latvia in particular and the region more broadly is that you have to understand that they did experience this very strong and almost virulent kind of experience of nationalism, of this kind of like first experience of having a real nation after centuries and centuries of developing the language, the literature, the culture, and having to pursue it in these kinds of various underground methods. You know, there were clubs that met in various universities during the Russian Empire, and then basically after the Russian Revolution, you got Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, many Eastern European nations got this kind of first bout of independence. It's also where we kind of get the first ideas of what nationalism is. The idea that a nation should have a language, that the language should have something to do with the people who live there, and that these stories, you know, have something unique about them. And that thread of kind of storytelling was one of the ones that I picked up as I started researching the book. And because of this experience of nationalism and nationhood was so violently lost with the beginning of the Soviet invasion in 1938, and because that is the kind of primary and I don't know, almost like primal scene of loss that they think, that Latvians think of whenever they think of World War II, that is the moment when their nationhood was severed, and then the German invasion comes next. And so I think as Americans we often only think of the German invasion, but in fact the Soviet takeover comes first, and then it's recursive, right? The Soviets return and take over again. And so I think, yeah, there's so much to say. And when Latvia became an independent nation again, basically after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was almost like a return to the 20s, because that's where they were picking up the thread from.
And it, you know, well, let's talk. I want to talk more about sort of present day Latvia, which you also talk about in the book. But so, can you just tell people who don't know a little bit about what this story you're telling is and how you stumbled upon it? Because I think how you stumbled upon it is, in some ways, sort of the driving force of the book.
Yeah, and it's, I wouldn't say that I stumbled upon it one day so much as I always knew it was kind of there, and would, you know, approach it very delicately and, you know, by turns. Basically, I grew up knowing that my paternal grandfather had disappeared after World War II, and because this was a very common fate, you know, many people died in unmarked graves, it wasn't of particular interest to me to go looking for more. And I was primarily familiar with my mother's family's experience, who, you know, were Russian Jews, some of whom were killed in Ukraine during the Holocaust, and others who were evacuated and survived. But basically what happens, like right around the time when I was starting as a, you know, young reporter at the New Republic, was also that certain archives were opened from Soviet Latvia, particularly the ones containing the records of KGB agents. So anyone who had registered with the KGB for a certain period of time was made to sign an index card, and that index card was stored at what used to be the KGB headquarters in Riga, called the Corner House, which is now a museum, which you could go walk around, and it's a very brutal place. And they once built a statue of Putin in the courtyard and burned it in effigy after he invaded Ukraine for the first time. But basically, after the Soviets fled, they left these index cards behind. And so I was starting out as a reporter at the precise moment when these conspiracies and cards and rumors were starting to flourish. And so I just thought, you know, I should put them together if I can. But I think the real moment, when I think you're referring to, is I came across, you know, I had too much time on my hands doing a master's degree, and I was kind of idly, you know, Googling as one does, and discovered that there was this ongoing court case about this man who I had never heard of, named Herbert Sukers, who was a member of the RS Commando, which was one of the most brutal killing commandos in World War II, which I discovered my grandfather was also a part of. And the headlines were in Latvian, so I read the articles as best as I could because I didn't have the language at the time, and found out that there was some kind of criminal investigation going on into this man who had been, as I found out, assassinated by Mossad. And so it's like all of these things are just insane to say quickly in a sentence, and yet that's how it was.
Well, tell us a little bit about. I don't want to try to pronounce his name. You just did.
Sucre.
Sucre.
It means sugar.
Sugar. Okay. Tell us a little bit about this man who's a fascinating background in Latvia and was seen as somewhat of a hero, and then the German invasion happens. And tell us a little bit about him, because he's in many ways the central character of the book.
Right, and he is the central character, and my grandfather is not the central character, which I think a lot of people, when they initially confront the book, believe. I really tried. I didn't want it to be a memoir. I was not interested in my own family story, which I think is frustrating, and I'm sorry for some readers. So this guy Tsukurs, he was a famous aviator, which is why we know so much about him. He was like a nationalist hero, and it was at the time when aviation was starting out, and when famously newspapers would track the flights of these first aviators who were making transcontinental flights, and you can kind of follow them day by day and see how they were progressing. And so he, not only did they track his flights, but he was also a journalist. So he wrote all these dispatches which were crazy, and thought of himself as this kind of emissary for the nation. And his allegiances are disputed when it comes to the Soviets. Some say that the Soviets, when they invaded for the first time, invited him to Moscow and tried to get him to build their planes for World War II. But the one thing we do know about him is that he was in the RS Commando, and that he was present at the scenes of various massacres. And he escaped to South America after the war with his family. He didn't think he had to hide. He went to Brazil, to Sao Paulo ultimately, and started talking to the press there about how he was a refugee from the war and how his story of miraculous survival needed to be told. And then he met a very ugly and deserving fate, I would say.
Well, so let me ask you a little bit about him and people like him, because I think one thing that your book wrestles with, and I think people have been wrestling with when they study countries in Eastern Europe, Latvia, Poland, etc., is to what degree people who collaborated with the Nazis and participated in horrific acts were going about them to survive, or going about their collaboration to survive, and to what degree there was deep-seated anti-Semitism, there was fascist sentiment. How did that sort of play out in Latvia?
Yeah, I think there are so many answers to that question, and the person I always cite is this historian named Rudita Vixen, who is the only person who's done a kind of rigorous analysis of every single man what that she could find in the RS Commando and why they joined. And so she's like, because they had to state their reasons when they were like, please join this killing commando. They didn't know it was a killing commando at the time, but they said, some of them said, I want bread, I want a gun, I want to get revenge on the Soviets for taking away my family and property. Or some of them said, I hate the Jews. But that was the minority. So I think also at the time you have to be aware that there was this very old trope that conflated Soviet communists with Jews, which is kind of the most virulent and persistent myth that lasts up to this day in Latvia and elsewhere. I think in his case, his defenders would say that it was obviously a choice of survival. But there are many accounts of brutality that, as I get into in the book, has been contested in so many different ways, because people are so, and by people I mean, prosecutors, are insistent on identifying exactly what he did and when, and kind of using that to unravel this already tenuous historical record. And the last thing I will say on this is that one of the survivors I spoke to for the book, Edward Anders, is one of the last remaining living Jewish survivors of the Holocaust from Latvia. He's an astrochemist, basically. So he studies the chemical composition of the planets and stars. And in his retirement, he took it upon himself to try to calculate actually how many, what the allegiances of Latvians were. And it's this kind of moving document in which he tries to calculate how many of them were, merely standing idly by versus how many of them were trying to protect Jews versus how many of them were murderous anti-Semites. And he does it with this kind of like exacting remove from his material, which I thought was kind of extremely moving. Yeah.
What did you know growing up about your grandfather and the way he sort of thought about these things? Thought about these issues that he dealt with in his own life, and then we'll get to the book. But when you were growing up, what did you think, or what did you know, if anything?
I knew nothing. I mean, when you know nothing, you suspect that there's a reason why you don't know nothing. So that was very much the case for me. I don't think I realized until I was confronted with the reality of it that he had actually served in what was a subsidiary unit of the SS. And it was especially jarring for me, obviously, because I grew up in a kind of Jewish family and had a Jewish education and all of this stuff, and then felt myself implicated, obviously, in this kind of, in his story. But we didn't know anything about it. He disappeared, he left nothing behind. There were like literal fragments. And so I had to, unbeknownst to me, he was something of a known figure in Latvia because he not only served in this commando, but also then switched sides and served in the KGB after the war, and then disappeared. And because it's a small country, people know everyone. Like, everyone is known, and so his mythology had somehow taken hold. And denialists had kind of heard about it and started novelizing it. And so I found this novel in which he was a main character. And I thought, okay, this is the only document I have, actually, of who this person is, beyond the kind of like few scraps that we have left behind. And so that was really the impetus for the book. Like, imagine if you come to this bookstore and find a book about, you know, one of your ancestors that's a novel, and it's like, you don't know where this is coming from. You know, as a writer, that's a uncanny thing.
Did you feel a sort of rooting interest while you were doing this? I mean, obviously this is a person you don't know, someone that your dad didn't know well. At all, yeah. And so I guess what I'm wondering was as you were going about this, were you tense? Were you anxious that you were going to find out something about this person, or was it sort of he was a distant relative and you didn't have an emotional attachment to what you found out? You were a journalist looking for what you were looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was, the reality was more of the latter. You know, I'm removed from these events. I didn't know this person. And I think that's the kind of tension and the beauty and kind of what makes it possible for me to write this book, certainly, and also what makes a lot of these new books about the Holocaust that are coming out from people in my generation interesting, because it's how do you actually tell these stories when you are so far removed? But I do think one of the things I found in talking about the book is that there is a certain, I don't know, I say that it's not a redemptive story. I say that it's not about him, and yet it continues kind of coming back to him in a way that I feel ambivalent and kind of conflicted about. But I have to say, part of the book kind of traces this criminal investigation, and if there was this moment, I'm sitting in the prosecutor's office, and I approached them as a journalist, and then they only saw my last name, and they were like, oh, you know, this is not just a journalist. And so it was unclear from the beginning kind of what my relationship was to it and what they thought it was.
Can you talk a little bit about the sort of present day, the prosecution, and how people in Latvia now are trying to wrestle with these events?
Yeah, well, it's funny. So the criminal investigation was about whether he could actually be held accountable for having pulled the trigger at a massacre in Riga. The biggest massacre took place in Rumbula Forest, which is right outside the city center. And there are many accounts of him being there. However, his defenders would say he was just literally, one of them said he was just, you know, in his car, looking around, listening to the noises, not doing anything wrong. So the criminal investigation is still ongoing. It's been, you know, appealed many times, and now it's kind of like indefinitely open in a particularly perverse way, I think, because to close the case, which they tried to do in his favor, would also mean to kind of close the case on the national story of complicity during this period. And so it's interesting to think about why they would want to keep it open in advance forever. But the other thing I will say is one of the controversies is, how he will be honored. He is very much still thought of as a public figure, heroized in various ways. Last week, his daughter was interviewed in a newspaper, and they were saying that they're going to have him buried in the National Cemetery, no matter what. So it's like this is continuing to get press. It's continuing to go on, and it will kind of until the end, I guess.
And do you think that this was a good faith effort by Latvia to come to grips with this stuff when it started out? I mean, how do you understand sort of the impetus for it, for bringing these things up with trials again?
No, not at all. It was the reason it started was because his descendants wanted him to be pardoned. So there's a rehabilitation. It's like overlapping kind of legal systems, and in this case, it was a hangover from the Soviet system when they wanted him to be rehabilitated and thereby cleared of having complicity with the Germans. But the irony is that rehabilitation is only used to talk about complicity with the Soviets, and so that couldn't proceed. But because it was involved in an allegation of murder, it had to be investigated, and so that's the kind of bind that the prosecutors were in, and that's why, for me, it kind of unlocked all these really interesting conflicts and tensions between history, memory, and law, in which you have this legal system which is very new, because the state itself is very new, and is kind of a hodgepodge of everything that came before, including European and American law. And you also have all of these histories that are inside of the legal code, and you have this uncertainty by the people who are practicing the law about what their sources are.
I was going to say, in the book, when you're talking about this, you say very directly also that this larger issue of that Holocaust testimonies are such a part of history in the way we think about the Holocaust historically. And yet these testimonies, which you see in books and you see in documentaries, as you say in your book, these are not fit sometimes for legal cases. And so there's this tension with the way we sort of think about the Holocaust and sort of bringing some sort of legal closure to it.
Right, exactly. And I think in this particular case, there were two levels of that. There's on one level, the use of Holocaust testimonies, in which the subject is no longer living, and so there's two options in that case. Either you find a descendant who heard that history and can speak to it and is willing to be deposed, some of whom were deposed by the FBI in the US, which is kind of interesting, or you discount it. And the other level of this is that there are the Soviets were the first ones who collected a lot of the Jewish testimonies because they were the ones who kind of liberated the Eastern Front. And so you have these testimonies that the prosecutor is dismissing because they say they cannot verify the conditions under which they were collected, of course, because the regime no longer exists. And so it's kind of this recursive negation, I guess, which I found really interesting and disturbing. And that's why at the end of the book, I'm kind of left with the last living people who can speak to these cases.
Can you talk a little bit about the way you think Russia's current place in the world is influencing the way people in Latvia view this period, if you think it is, and how that operates?
This period meaning?
The late 30s and World War II.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now they are threatened, obviously, by the idea of a return to that kind of cycle of invasion and repression. But that is the thing against which the nation coheres right now. And the same is true of, Estonia, which is donating some absurd percentage of its own GDP to Ukrainian defense right now, because I think it's kind of considered very much and understandably one and the same fight. I think the fact that Latvia in particular now has joined the EU shifts, and it's been interesting because part of when they joined the EU in the 2004, there was a certain expectation of how they understood their own past that came along with that, which is kind of akin to how we kind of, I would say, as Americans, view Holocaust memory and history, where it's like you have to build memorials, you have to have yearly commemorations, on this day, you have to show up, and all these things weren't being done before 2004. And so there is this impression that this was kind of imposed from on high, and so that it was something that needed to be done in order to become a true European entity. And I think we're still kind of seeing the repercussions of that and the discomforts that came along with that, but that couldn't have been voiced at the time.
I want to talk a little bit about what sort of book you wanted to write. I think I don't know if it was sparked in part by the fact that you say this in the book that you found this novel with this information about your grandfather, which you then sort of reflect in the book, sort of sparks ruminations from you about what sort of book you're writing and what sort of book you wanted to write. How did you decide on the form that you decided on? And even in this conversation, you've mentioned a couple times maybe slight annoyance that people see it as a memoir or something else. So I'm curious what that process was like, because this is a subject that you could have gone in many different directions.
Yeah, well, actually, originally I wanted the title of the book to be You Will Never Kill Him, which is the same title of the novel about my grandfather, because I thought, why not write a kind of counter history? But I wanted to play with the genre of the spy novel, because I think it would have been really easy to just write about the assassination of Super's by Mossad, and to kind of leave it there. But I was far more interested, actually not in the assassination, but in everything that came after it, and how it kind of left the story open, and all of the cracks, that came with that, and all of the opportunities for revision and conspiracy and, storytelling, I guess. And so I was left to kind of collecting all of these. And so at the beginning of the prologue kind of plays with the narrative of the spy novel, which I found in the bookstore that day, and I think, made me really think hard about what that genre does and how it treats history and kind of the people who are, kind of behind the scenes, but who we mythologize so much, But I also felt like one of the things I was told when I was reporting was that there is no Holocaust narrative in Latvia, that, the ones that exist are in Russian, they haven't been translated into Latvian, or like there isn't really an understanding there of the complexity of the alliances or of the faiths. And so part of me honestly was trying to provide that and just saying I happen to have firsthand access to this extremely bizarre story, and awful story. And so I have some kind of obligation to act into it. And also, because there is this open investigation, which is taking into account, fabrications of all kinds, why don't I put together a work of nonfiction that actually might influence the case?
The other thing that you kind of ruminate on in the book is this idea of what a book can accomplish and what a trial can accomplish. And obviously those are broadly different things that we set out to do. But at the same time, I think there's some understanding, which you sort of allude to, that both of them are sort of trying to get at the truth in some way, even though they have these different ways of going about them and different methods and different goals. So how do you think about that now, having finished the book?
Yeah, I would say that the process of reporting it made me develop an extreme allergy to forensic truth, like the kind of truth that you would get from a trial, in which, there's that great line that you don't need to prove 1,000 murders if you can prove 100, right? So then those other 900 murders are all of a sudden not included in the legal record. They become the material of history or of novels to pick up, and that's kind of what minimizes these stories, I think, and makes them kind of like lesser than themselves, right, in the eyes of the law. And I guess one of the points I wanted to make in the book was that there has to be a moment when it passes out of active litigation. And that's kind of, I thought a lot about the subtitle, and I still feel kind of odd about it. And I write that I didn't mean it, as a prescription, but rather as kind of a, I don't know, like a reflection or a provocation or a warning of some kind, just about this moment where it should be passing out of memory and into history, and we've known that this is going to happen for a long time. But along the way, we also need to accept that these things can no longer be litigated in a particular way. But then we see a place like Latvia or Poland choosing to pursue these cases for ultimately kind of nationalistic and revisionist purposes.
I want to turn it over to if anyone has any questions. I have some more questions if not, but if I'm happy to take any questions for Linda. Yeah.
Has the book had any effect in Latvia, as far as you know?
The question was, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Has the book had any effect in Latvia, as far as you know?
Hi, nice to see you. Honestly, I think it's kind of too soon. The case is still open, which is, the one thing that, to my mind, would, if it were to close and say, yes, his participation is beyond a doubt, and we don't want to, and I think if I were, suddenly in charge of the prosecution, I would kind of say, we have these facts that are beyond dispute, and we shouldn't do further damage by trying to discern what we can, pin down from what has been handed down to us, from the Soviet archives or the Latvian ones or, the few living survivors. And if it could actually be closed in a public way, I think that would be cathartic. On so many levels, but that hasn't happened yet. I do think that there was a very large restitution award given to the Jewish community in Latvia quite recently, which is the product of a lot of work, and so I think that's, really important progress so far. So we'll see.
Can you, earlier in the conversation, you said that you think that if the case is sort of kept open forever, or sort of for a while at least, for God knows how long, that's something, it seems like you were hinting would sort of be to the advantage of everyone or something, and that there might be some, can you talk more about what you were implying there?
I guess I was implying that no one knows what they want from this case. It's like, it's this strange entity that you almost never confront, where even the people who are in charge of the investigation don't know what they're doing, or why they're doing it, or how it originated, There isn't a named plaintiff. There isn't, the defense is kind of, it's the Jewish community, but only, they're not a party in the case. They're just participating in it because they feel obligated to. And so it's this kind of like, strange amalgamation, I guess, that we wouldn't see in this country, I think, which I think tells us a lot about that, the fraught period itself, right, is like, okay, let's try to come up with a conclusion, and we can't because of our own inability on many different levels.
Any other questions? More questions?
Yeah. I haven't read the book, but very much look forward to doing so. I wanted to hear how you conceive of the difference between historical revisionism and revisitation. You talk about how you're really navigating this nebulous case, right? And there are all these cracks, and it's the question of sort of like discovering history, but also, creating an artifact that people can revisit and study and think through. So I'm just kind of curious how you navigated that.
The question was about how to think about revisionism versus revisitation while you're working on a book like this, and creating an artifact itself while your book becomes an artifact itself, I think is what you were saying.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think I ended up talking to a lot of historians and lawyers and witnesses who themselves feel kind of implicated and conflicted about these questions, right? And, having given their answers to so many lawyers first and then to so many historians and then having to go and do it all over again, as if it's kind of this never-ending circle between the two of them. That is kind of the trap that I found myself in, basically, and I was trying to write my way out of it. And I guess, there was a legal historian who told me, at some point, the lawyers have to hand the baton to the historians, right? But then what happens when the lawyers come and pick it back up again and say, these historical conclusions that you've arrived at, actually, we don't agree, and we're just going to actually, in some cases in Poland, put you on trial for arriving at these conclusions and see if we can, it's almost like replicating an experiment scientifically, except that's not how historical judgment works. Kind of deliberately, it is opposite to legal judgment, or of a different nature fundamentally. And so I think there's this central kind of confusion. And I just, for myself, I wanted to understand that. And that's why this book, I think, doesn't fit quite neatly into any genre, because I was trying to pick up not only the different stories and what they were trying to do with this, but also the different forms of, we might say reckoning, we might say judgment or justice, whatever it may be, and kind of comparing them.
Linda, I'm curious about your parents' reaction, sort of like when you first decided to do this, and then after the book came out,
Yeah.
what each of them thought.
Totally.
What did your parents think? Yeah.
Great question.
What do your parents say to you?
I know. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My mother, both of them were kind of like co-conspirators, I would say.
In what?
In the research, actually. Because, on the one hand, I needed them because they had much, obviously, first-hand access to the case in a way that I didn't. They knew the stories. They had been told the stories. They had rumors that they could tell to me in a very offhanded way sometimes, like, oh yeah, like we were walking down the street in Riga one day and a man came up and said that he knew my father in the German times, that kind of thing. And that he was very popular. Like, this is how it was delivered to me, like, in fits and starts. And now, of course, I think the story is in abeyance on so many different levels, right? Because there is no conclusion, and I think there is a hope still that at one point there will be some kind of, I don't know, verdict of some kind. But the interesting thing is actually, so when I say that, I mean, the photographs that are in this book were also attached to the archive, or to the excerpts that went online. And to have a photograph online is different. And so I asked my father's permission. He said, of course, like, maybe someone will recognize my dad. And maybe someone will come up and say, I know what happened to him. And in fact, someone messaged me on Facebook after the book went to press saying, my grandfather also served in the Estonian town where your grandfather disappeared, and he remembered that one day he was walking on the beach and he found a man lying on the shore with a gun next to him and a note in his pocket that said, I'm sorry, I couldn't complete the mission or something. And so this is just another story, I don't know if it's true. We talked to him, who knows, but it's just another part of it that will always be there and kind of, indeterminate.
More questions?
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Tom.
I feel like it would be hard to know when a book is done. Are there pieces you had to sort of stop digging into and let go of in order to think of it as done?
Yeah. Sorry.
That was loud enough, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is one of them. That's like the story I just told is one example where I was like, okay, I feel like I have done enough at this point. And for me, it was kind of an exorcism, I think, on some level, to feel like I had done my due diligence almost in looking into this story. And I kind of hope that it'll be translated into Latvian eventually. I kind of hope that it has its own life beyond me and outside of me and kind of like travels on in a way that I don't necessarily need to be a part of. And I think a lot of people in Latvia have similar stories, and a lot of people throughout the region have similar stories that I at first dismissed and then discovered that I couldn't really ignore it forever. So, but now I think it's done.
More questions? I'll just ask if, while we're waiting maybe for more questions, but I'm curious, the book sort of came out, was being published, was being written in the time when Ukraine was invaded in the end of February of last year. And I'm curious how that event, if it did, change the way you thought about the project you were embarking on, or just, now it's been almost a year of war, how that's, you think either changed the reception or how you thought about it. It's sort of an open-ended question, but it did occur to me.
Yeah, no, I did think about it a lot, particularly towards the end of the book process, because one of the things I write about is the Soviet approach to post-war trials, how they put the Nazis, it was like 24-hour trials, and they were hung publicly the next day. So it's very, very quick proceedings, but that is a kind of justice. That was like, you don't see the individuals who were subjected to those proceedings being the cult, like having cults of personality right now, because there was some kind of trial, even if it's a perverted trial, even if it's not justice as we would recognize it, there is some proceeding. And I think in the Zucker's case, there spectacularly wasn't that. Instead, we have this assassination that, is mythologized and lives on in this very strange way. So that was when, in the first days of the war in Ukraine, images of those Soviet trials started circulating, partly because many of them took place in Ukraine. In fact, the first one took place in Ukraine, and the Kharkiv trial was one of the most famous proceedings. And so as Kharkiv was being bombed, people were returning to that moment. And I think people are still returning to that moment to think about what kind of justice would mean for Ukraine, both on the Ukrainian side where they're conducting their own prosecutions and on the Russian side where they have threatened and are kind of already pursuing exactly this kind of form of abbreviated justice in quotation marks.
You mentioned earlier, when you mentioned the assassination, the Mossad assassination, that you thought it was sort of deserved. I can't remember the word you used, but a word like deserved. And aside from sort of any moral issues involved in either assassination or, the punishment that Nazis deserve, or collaborators deserve, I'm curious how you think assassinating people plays a role in the kind of historical memory of these issues. Do you think it short circuits it? Do you think it drives interest in it? I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think in this particular case, what fascinated me about it is that it was explicitly done to, it seems, to foreclose the possibility of him furthering his story or like living on. It wasn't meant to foreclose justice. It was like they left on his body, and this is where the title comes from, they left on his body an excerpt of the closing speech of Sir Hartley Shawcross, the British prosecutor at Nuremberg, as if to say, you should have been at this trial, here is the judgment, it's already been delivered, here is your sentence, we are giving it to you right now. And so I think the debate about what they intended to accomplish is fascinating, and whether it was meant to be, a kidnapping, we can talk about that. Many people believe it. But I think in this case it shows that assassinations, and I do think, in the other cases, like Mengele, for instance, you do see that the subjects of them have afterlives in a way that is that's what's not deserved, I think.
Afterlives, and that there's more interest in them, or that they're...
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, and like that they are subject to kind of storytelling and, heroization in different ways, but also that, like the Mengele example, that is kind of foundational to how we think about forensics and how we kind of identify the disappeared now. And his bones are still being used in like a Buenos Aires medical school for instruction because no one wanted them, obviously.
Any more questions? I don't know if we had any online questions or...
Not yet.
Okay. I wanted to ask, we only have time for a couple more questions, but I wanted to sort of ask another question about current day Latvia, and about sort of how these things are remembered. Is your sense that it sort of breaks down, that there's sort of a typical right-left debate there about these issues, or is it not that simple in terms of you can sort of imagine where the right-left debate would go and who would be on what side, in terms of how to remember the different occupations and so on. But is that, do you find that that's the case, or it's much more complex than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, I think it's not so much right left so much as it's about, in my understanding, kind of this fervent nationalism, which does fuel the far right, which is present in the region. And obviously, like in Estonia, this became very, very clear because there was a far right party that made its way very prominently into parliament recently. So it's like you have these very strong presences, which are minorities, but they make them so they're very loud and they make themselves very felt in politics and in kind of, because these are small countries, it's very easy for them to kind of have a big footprint. But I think the conflict is really between that school and the kind of more Europeanization, kind of Brussels view of politics, which I think is like this kind of bind that Latvia and the kind of all of the 2004 accession nations find themselves in, where they on the one hand have to be kind of part of the EU, kind of focused towards Brussels, but also kind of figuring out who they are in this world, and knowing that they share the same background and the same histories as, say, Georgia. There's this wonderful anthropologist, that's Danoska, who has this story in her book. It's called The School of Europeanization, and she tells a story of a Georgian man who walked from, I forgot which city it was in Georgia, but he walked from there to Riga. And when he got to Riga, he was detained by border authorities, and he said, "What? We're exactly like you. We just ended up on the wrong side of, the new borders." And he has a point. So I think that's still kind of being worked out in real time. And I think now, because we just had the last 10 years of trying to work towards increasing Europeanization and integration, now we're seeing the kind of backlash against that, even though Ukraine has changed that somewhat.
Ukraine has changed that how?
Well, because now it's like, I think you see the Eastern nations kind of leading the charge to defend Ukraine kind of most vociferously, and obviously we know that that war has like bound Europe together, supposedly for now. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things was, there have been a lot of stories written about this recently, about this sort of flowering of a sort of broadly Eastern European identity, because, in the debate over Ukraine, we see that sort of Eastern Europe has been much more in favor of sending advanced weaponry to Ukraine, more in favor than France and Germany, and the sense that Eastern European identity may be sort of developing in a new way because of the war. Is that, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that, Eric.
I guess I wouldn't say Eastern European identity. I think that's so strong. I think it's always been there as this kind of unifying myth, or not even myth, reality. Like, that is how they think of their relation to each other. And even in Belarus, when there was this moment when Belarus was opening up and no longer needed a visa to go, and you had there was this moment when they were like, no, that you're one of us, we're part of this kind of same story, and now obviously that's being exploited. But I have to say also, my friend Jacob Mikanowski has a great book coming out soon called Goodbye Eastern Europe, which is about precisely this, and what Eastern European identity means and how it's shifted, and how it's always kind of been, to speak of it as a monolith is kind of impossible, because it's always been home to so many kind of different kinds of nations. Yeah, I don't know. I think, if anything, it's making the rest of the world aware of Ukrainian identity as distinct, which I think was a question mark before, and now I don't think it is.
Linda, thank you so much. The book is Come to This Court and Cry, and it's fantastic, and there's just a ton of stuff in here that we haven't discussed at all, and just in awe of how you wove all this amazing stuff together into a just fascinating narrative. So go buy the book, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can we give one more hand for Isaac Chotiner and Linda Kinstler?